Next, I want to take a minute to introduce our morning speakers. But before I do, I want to reflect on a recent comment in the press on Canada's position on ballistic missile defense. Last month, the Minister of National Defense, Ms. Anita Anand, said that Canada is weighing whether to reverse course and finally join the US in defending against long-range ballistic missiles, as reported by CP, and I quote, Ms. Anand said, we are certainly taking a full and comprehensive look at that question, as well as what it takes to defend the continent across the board. We are leaving no stone unturned in this major review of continental defense, unquote. In my mind, that review must also look at the factors that will be discussed here today. Our speakers will examine the geostrategic considerations that Canada should consider when looking at protecting our own interests vis-a-vis continental defense and maritime security, as well as those of our allies. Now, to introduce this morning's speakers. Our first speaker will be Captain Retired Norm Jolin. Norm served 37 years in the Canadian Navy, where he saw service across the entire spectrum of maritime operations. He served at sea for the majority of his career in both ships and in submarines. And he commanded a squadron of minor warships and later the Halifax-class frigate HMCS Montreal. Since his retirement, Norm has become what I consider as the go-to guy in many ways when it comes to historical background and current issues related to submarines in the RCN. He's also known for his expertise in naval weapon systems. He's written papers, articles, and commentaries on naval subjects, particularly submarines, and he's authored a book on Canada's admirals. Today, Norm works as an associate consultant with CFN Consultants. Norm will be followed by a tag team presentation of Dr. Adam Lajeunesse and Mr. Tim Choi. Adam, PhD, is an associate professor teaching in the public policy and governance program at St. Francis Xavier University. He is the author of the award-winning book, Lock, Stock, and Icebergs, A Political History of the Northwest Passage, as well as co-author of the 2017 monograph, China's Arctic Ambitions and What They Mean for Canada. And he was co-editor of Canadian Arctic Operations, 1941 to 2015, Lessons Learned, Lost, and Relearned. Adam works on questions of Arctic sovereignty and security policy and has written extensively on Canadian Armed Forces Arctic operations, maritime security, Canadian-American cooperation in the North, and Canadian Arctic history. Mr. Tim Choi is completing his PhD at the University of Calgary Centre for Military Security and Strategic Studies, where his dissertation is entitled Maritime Strategies of the North, the Sea Power of Smaller Maritime Forces in an Era of Broadened Security. He serves on the editorial board of and is the photo editor at the Canadian Naval Review, and he is currently a consultant on naval affairs for the British American Security Information Council. Tim has written many papers on his assessment of various aspects of naval affairs, several of which NAC has posted on its website. You can find them on our Naval Affairs pull down at the website. Finally, to close out this morning's speakers, our keynote speaker will be Commodore Retired James Clark. A brief bio of Jamie. He's a third generation member of Canada's Armed Forces, a naval warfare officer who has commanded submarines, a frigate, HMCS St. John's, and the Canadian Submarine Force from 2014 to 2017. He completed his undergrad studies at the University of Western Ontario in mathematics, holds a master's degree from the UNB in engineering and the Royal Military College of Canada in defense studies. He's also a graduate of the Joint Command and Staff Program at the Canadian Forces College, as well as the Naval Command College at the U.S. Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. He completed his military service as the Deputy Director of Strategy, Policy, and Plans at NORAD and U.S. Northcom in Colorado Springs. And since 2021, Jamie has been a Director of Business Development with Lockheed Martin in Canada. So it's 9:18. My estimate was to get us started by 9:15, so we're doing well. I'll turn the floor over now to Norm Jolin for the first presentation. Norm.
Tim, do you hear me?
I hear you, Norm. Go ahead.
Okay, great. I just wanted to, as everything, I've been sitting up in a holding pattern here, and then you hit the magic button quick as a flash, and nothing happens. Okay, good morning. Thanks again for that, Tim. This morning, I'd like to talk a little bit about the history of submarines in Canada, and a little bit of not just the submarines themselves, but the procurement that goes on and where we're looking forward to. Today, the world security situation is undergoing a long anticipated return to state-on-state conflict, not seen since 1945, with Russia and China explicitly threatening world order. While defense is never a topic that captures natural interest, we have of late seen a significant surge in Canadian media interest in defense, as well as a modest increase to the defense budget in the recent federal budget. That said, it's noteworthy that the government has yet to commit to any substantial change in defense policy, and the recent budget lacked specific detail as to future defense spending, only indicating that a, quote, swift defense policy review, unquote, will be undertaken. Notwithstanding a commitment to a future defense policy review, the Trudeau government priorities remain focused on climate change and social programs, priorities which are unlikely to change during their mandate. Despite all this, one would think that the recent bellicose rise of the Russian threat would have simplified the justification necessary for the renewal of Canada's submarine capability. Although the crisis in Ukraine has generated renewed interest in defense, all indications are that Canada will continue to rely on our geographical position next to the United States of America to provide for national defense. Nevertheless, Canada has an obligation to contribute to the North American continental defense, and it remains a top priority for the Americans. This should be an area where a renewed submarine capability can be justified, but it comes with challenges, notably the ability to operate submarines in the Canadian Arctic. A future Canadian submarine capability must be able to operate in the open ocean environment of the Atlantic and Pacific, as well as an ability to deny access to the Arctic archipelago. Furthermore, historic realities of Canadian defense budgets demand that a submarine capability must be affordable, while sustaining political support over multiple governments during the procurement process. It must also be able to provide future Canadian governments options in which to respond to international crises, being able to operate at great distances from Canada for prolonged periods in some of the most unforgiving waters in the world. It is these three factors that have always framed naval procurement strategy. But culturally, Canada sees itself as a continental state, and our significant maritime geography often tends to take a back seat to national will and in decision making. In that, fleet composition, based on a modest number of frigates and destroyers, has always been the default culture, which makes it difficult to have an educated discussion on the need for submarines, particularly if it threatens RCN cultural norms. To stimulate the debate as to why Canada needs submarines and the challenges facing the RCN, it's worthwhile to get everyone on the same page by conducting a quick overview of the torturous history of submarines in Canada and highlight how and why decisions were made vis-a-vis the procurement of that capability. The Canadian Naval Service was founded in 1910, with the Naval Service Act achieving royal assent on the 4th of May 1910, and the service subsequently being renamed the Royal Canadian Navy in August 1911. At this time, the RCN fleet was basically two ships, the ex-British cruisers HMCS Niobe and HMCS Rainbow, based on the east and west coasts of Canada, respectively. In August 1914, the British Empire went to war, and Canada, as part of the empire, was thrust into a conflict that it was ill prepared for, a theme that will be continued throughout history, I might add. As the Dominion government was scrambling with mobilization and liaising with Whitehall as to what forces to send, the British, including the then First Lord of the Admiralty, then Winston Churchill, stressed the need for Canadian soldiers and not naval forces. Suffice to say, the RCN was not top of mind for the Borden government of 1914. However, on the eve of the First World War, a deal for two submarines had been built in Seattle, Washington, for the Chilean government fell through, and the Premier of British Columbia moved quickly to purchase them before Canada officially became a belligerent nation. The Dominion government subsequently ratified this purchase on the 6th of August, 1914, and commissioned them as HMCS CC-1 and HMCS CC-2 because they resemble the British C-class submarines. The purchase was not exactly the plan of the Dominion government. However, the RCN now had 2 submarines, of which they operated throughout the war, initially on the west coast until transferred to the east coast in 1917, where they stayed until they were paid off for disposal and scrapping in 1920. Interestingly, during the First World War, Canada built H-class submarines under license in Montreal for the Royal Navy, the British Royal Navy. Although not of the batch of H-class submarines built in Canada, at the end of the First World War, Canada was gifted 2 H-class submarines by Britain, CH-14 and CH-15, which were commissioned into service in the RCN in April 1921. However, by 1922, dramatic cuts in defense spending caused the RCN to give up its submarine capability, and the submarines were paid off in June 1922. In the interwar years, Canada was not interested in pursuing submarine capability, and all efforts were focused on maintaining a mobilization base of personnel through the Naval Reserve and slowly growing the fleet of destroyers. On the 10th of September 1939, the Royal Canadian Navy entered the Second World War with a small fleet based on 6 destroyers, which over the course of the war grew to over 400 ships, but no submarines. The RCN remained a destroyer navy with ambitions in naval aviation and eventually did acquire aircraft carriers, but submarines were not a priority at the time. The point to take away is that notwithstanding the huge impact that submarines had on the naval warfare in the first half of the 20th century, Canada was more interested in aviation than submarines, and then only in their role as training vehicles for anti-submarine forces. Undoubtedly, the image of submarines engaged in anti-commerce warfare, particularly the Battle of the Atlantic, and US President Roosevelt's infamous rattlesnakes of the sea categorization of the U-boat threat with the image of sinking merchant ships, defined public perception about submarines. But it was the first modern submarine, the German Type 21 Elektroboot, that would soon fuel a post-war realization that the best ASW weapon was in fact another submarine. With the cessation of hostilities with Germany in 1945, 2 Type 9 U-boats surrendered to the RCN, U-190 and U-889. These are commissioned at the RCN for tests and trials and not as operational submarines. U-889 was subsequently turned over to the United States Navy in January 46, and U-190 was paid off and sunk on Trafalgar Day in 1947 in the spot where she had sunk HMCS Esquimalt in 1945. To be clear, these submarines were never envisioned to become a Canadian submarine capability. Rather, they operated, mainly surfaced, for trials in support of anti-submarine weapons and sensors. At this time, the United States Navy had realized the threat potential of new construction Soviet submarines based on the JERP Type 21 design, which would subsequently become the Zulu, Whiskey, and Romeo classes. In 1949, the U.S. Navy initiated Project KO, which included the establishment of a submarine development group that was tasked with solving the problem of using submarines to detect and destroy enemy submarines. In 1951, the first submarine explicitly designed for that mission, the SSK, that's for Ship Submersible for Submarine, and K for Killer, became available, later known as the Barracuda class SSKs. This is 1951. Things move quickly. The RCN's immediate post-war plans had envisioned aircraft carriers, cruisers, and flotillas of destroyers. However, demobilization and post-war fiscal realities of the late 1940s saw the fleet significantly reduced. And although the introduction of naval aviation did continue apace, the Korean War and the subsequent start of the Cold War was a stimulus for post-war naval construction with an emphasis on ASW capability. While the fleet was being rebuilt in the 1950s around the new Saint Laurent class destroyer escorts, a submarine capability for ASW training was to be provided by the Royal Navy, not the Royal Canadian Navy. The British 6th Submarine Squadron provided 2 A-class submarines on a rotational basis to the Atlantic Fleet from 1954 until 1967. The crews were a mix of British and Canadian submariners under the operational and administrative control of the Canadian Flag Officer Atlantic Coast, while the West Coast relied on borrowing U.S. Navy resources for training. In 1958, Vice Admiral Harry DeWolf, the RCN Chief of Naval Staff, faced the fiscal reality that the Navy must be affordable if it was to survive. He made the decision that the RCN would specialize in ASW. This was a catalyst of a balanced Canadian fleet that necessarily included a submarine capability, although initially only for training of ASW forces. Almost paradoxically, a year earlier, not only had the RCN decided it needed to acquire submarines, it was also seriously looking at nuclear-powered submarines. The US Navy had envisioned the need for an easily mass-produced submarine that could counter the hundreds of advanced Soviet submarines expected to be in service by 1960. By 1960, the Soviets had 320 new submarines, of which 215 were the Whiskey class. Significantly, though, 8 were nuclear-powered. This caused a shift to nuclear-powered submarines as a more effective blue water anti-submarine warfare submarine, initially for the reasons of speed, but later to counter to the new threats Soviet submarines represented. Heretofore, the primary concern over Soviet submarines was the interdiction of the sea lines of communication. However, cruise and ballistic missile firing submarines now threatened the homeland and consequently became a higher ASW priority. Moreover, as nuclear-powered submarine numbers increased in the 1960s, conventional submarines were seen as better shallow water and choke point ASW submarines. In short, if you wanted a meaningful ASW capability in your Navy has to operate submarines. Initial discussions were with the United States Navy. In 1961, Canada acquired HMCS Grilse, a retired US Navy Baleo-class submarine, formerly the USS Burfish, on a 5-year lease agreement to be based on the west coast of Canada. But at the same time, the RCN was planning in place for a new fleet, which includes 6 of the latest American Barbell-class conventional submarines, as aspirations to transition to nuclear submarines had shown to be too expensive. So this is 1959. Look at the difference between 1951 and 1959 in submarine design development for a conventional submarine. Things were moving. But even a modest ambition proved too costly, and in March 1962, it was decided to acquire 3 of the less expensive British Oberon-class conventional submarines, modified to meet Canadian requirements to replace the British submarine support, all to be based on the east coast of Canada. It's worthy of note that the Canadian Oberons were modified from build to accept the Mark 37 torpedo system, which is a swim-out weapon. While not required for the Mark 37 torpedoes, the torpedo tube dual pressure firing system was retained and allowed Canadian Oberons to discharge British torpedoes, mines, and later the Mark 48 torpedo. The point being, there were Canadian modifications to the British design on build, but these changes were modest, and by retaining design items where it is cheaper to do so than remove them, can provide future flexibility. At this stage, it's important to remember that submarines were being procured for the provision of ASW training. The rationale was not for the conduct of submarine operations, something that would eventually change. Canada commissioned the first Canadian Oberon-class submarine, HMCS Ojibwe, in September '65 at the Royal Navy's Chatham Dockyard. Of note, the submarine had laid down as HMS Onyx and was switched in build, resulting in an internal configuration that differed from the other 2 Canadian submarines, O-class submarines. In June '67, Onondaga was commissioned at Chatham, and the last Canadian O-class, HMCS Okanagan, was commissioned a year later in June '68, also at Chatham. In 1968, the submarine capability on the west coast was replaced with another ex-US Navy conventional submarine, HMCS Rainbow, the former USS Argonaut, which Canada purchased and operated until 1974, when, due to budget limitations, it was retired without replacement. But it was also in the 1970s that Maritime Command realized that submarines offered Canada more than just training vehicles. They had to have the ability to provide significant ASW capability. But to do this, they needed modifications and upgrades. In line with similar modifications being conducted by the Australians to their Oberon-class submarines, Canada's 3 submarines were upgraded in the 1980s with new fire control, sonar, and communications equipment under the Submarine Operational Update Project, SOUP. It was later followed by the replacement of the Mark 37 torpedoes with the Mark 48 Mod 4 torpedoes, and later the bow sonar with the Type 2051 Triton. At the same time, a replacement submarine project for the Oberons was stood up. It was named the Canadian Submarine Acquisition Project, or CASAP. It was to acquire 6 conventional submarines as a replacement for the Oberon-class submarines that had been built in Canada in the 1960s. However, the Conservative government's 1987 defense policy decided that Canada needed an Arctic under ice capability, and the project was rescoped to acquire 10 to 12 SSNs and renamed CASAP SSN. In support of the envisioned requirement for a significant increase in the number of trained submarine personnel, Canada procured a recently retired British Oberon-class submarine for alongside training. In 1989, the former HMS Olympus was transferred to Canada, not as an operational submarine, but as a alongside harbor training submarine. Contrary to some reports, this submarine was never commissioned by Canada. However, by 1989, the costs associated with operating nuclear-powered submarines proved too great in competition with other government fiscal priorities. As part of a reassessment of political priorities in 1989, the ambitious 1987 defense policy, Challenge and Commitment, was essentially abandoned, and the CASAP SSN project was stopped in April 1989. Unfortunately, this was at the same time the Cold War was ending, and the original submarine replacement project subsequently became an early casualty of the reduced defense expenditures, as did the third batch of 6 Canadian patrol frigates. The latter point is significant, as the budget of the original CASAP SSK project had been combined with the third batch of frigates as a placeholder against the then $8 billion estimated SSN project costs for CASAP SSN. In the 1990s, the government of Canada needed to address a huge budgetary deficit, and there was no funding for a replacement submarine force. Nor with the collapse of the Soviet Union was there a sellable rationale for maintaining a submarine capability. That said, the UK was going through similar defense reductions, and in 1994 declared their 4 new Upholder-class conventional submarines surplus to requirement. According to a 2005 Standing Committee on National Defence and Veterans Affairs report, quote, the Navy evaluated the British submarines in 1995 in preparation for their imminent acquisition, but the cabinet decision to go ahead was delayed. Concerned about competing demands on the federal treasury budget during a period of fiscal restraint and a possible public reaction to the announcement of such a military equipment purchase, Prime Minister Chrétien delayed approving the project at that time. Months of delay turned into years, and the project was finally approved by cabinet only in 1998, unquote. So finally, after external pressure from the United States, where 2 successive U.S. defense secretaries strongly recommended Canada maintain a conventional submarine capability as a meaningful contribution to North American defense, the Liberal government agreed to purchase the 4 Upholder-class submarines as an interim solution entitled Submarine Capability Life Extension Project. This was not a replacement for the project for the Oberon class. Rather, it simply allowed Canada to maintain a submarine capability until such times as a replacement project could be stood up. The decision also came at the end of the service lives of the 3 Canadian O-class submarines, with Ojibwe paying off in May of 98, followed by Okanagan in September 98, and Onondaga remaining in service until July 2000. Ojibwe and Onondaga were saved for the Breakers Yards and our museums in Port Burwell, Ontario, and Rimouski, Quebec, respectively. Regrettably, and arguably the nicest of the 3, Okanagan, did not survive. The paying off of Ojibwe and Okanagan while running Onondaga to generate submarines allowed for the nucleus of crews which transitioned to the 4 Upholder-class submarines that were being reactivated at Barrow, Furnace in the UK. HMCS Victoria, the former HMS Unseen, commissioned in December 2000. HMCS Windsor, the former HMS Unicorn, commissioned in October 2003. HMCS Corner Brook, the former HMS Ursula, commissioned in June of 2003. And HMCS Chicoutimi, the former HMS Upholder, was accepted by Canada in October of 2004. However, she suffered a major fire while transiting to Canada, which significantly delayed her entry into service, eventually commissioning in September 2015. Since entering service, the Victoria class have completed their Canadianization refits, which replaced a number of their fitted British systems that were not compatible with Canadian systems and difficult to support. Specifically, Lockheed Martin Canada and North Star Technical upgraded and installed the submarine's Libroscope torpedo fire control system, which had been previously fitted to the Canadian Oberons. This was necessary to meet Canada's operational requirements in support of the Mark 48 heavyweight torpedo, which are in Canadian service. The British do not operate the Mark 48 torpedo. As well, the communications suite had to be changed to meet Canadian national requirements, and an inertial navigation system, which is common with the Canadian surface fleet, was installed. Initially, the submarines fitted sonars were retained. Since then, the sonars are continuing to be upgraded, most recently by fitting the US AM BQQ-10 sonar, which is common with the United States Navy's Virginia-class SSNs, and is a significant upgrade to the fitted sonar suite. In 2017, Canada and Strong Secure Engage confirmed the intent to maintain a submarine capability by committing to upgrade Victoria-class under the Victoria-class modernization program, which will ensure these submarines remain operationally relevant to the end of their service life in the mid to late 2030s. In 2021, the Commander RCN announced his intention to conduct a preliminary investigation into a future Canadian patrol submarine project. Thus, 24 years after submarine capability life extension, SICL, Canada is now on the cusp of forming a Canadian patrol submarine project to deliver a submarine capability before the service lives of Victoria-class submarines end in the 2030s. In sum, Canadian naval history has shown a replacement submarine capability is not guaranteed. The number of submarine cannons required were never calculated. Rather, they were simply a reflection of what was available in the case of Victoria class and or affordable in the case of the Oberon class at the time. The submarines Canada acquired were military off the shelf with minimal Canadianization on delivery. The submarines Canada acquired were not built in Canada. A submarine capability is difficult to rationalize and sustain with government. The Royal Canadian Navy's priority has historically been the surface fleet based on frigates and destroyers. So the naval staff are now engaged in developing the basic design requirements of a Canadian submarine, numbers and rough order of magnitude costing, as well as build options which are critical if Canada is to avoid a gap in capability when the Victoria class reach the end of their service lives. Be there no doubt, this will be a Herculean task for such a small team. And to succeed, they will need to quickly focus on an affordable solution that will be supportable by at least 5 successful federal governments. Based on historic project timelines, Canada is very late to the game. The only remedy being the avoidance of delays in the procurement process and a reduction of build time. As no Canadian shipyard has a submarine build capability, the time to tool up a yard for submarine construction would be prohibitive for the initial orders. Total project costs, not just the sail away price per unit, will govern the overall numbers to be acquired, with the RCN keen to have a supportable number of submarines on each coast. As the RCN is looking to replace the Victoria-class submarines by the late 2030s, project timelines will be very tight, and industry partnerships will have to form early if the project is to deliver on time. This slide shows the necessary administration a project must go through in a procurement process. To maintain schedule, it is imperative that the appropriate staff work is in place to meet each deliverable underpinned by a steadfast determination of the incumbent leadership to meet these milestones. Otherwise, the project will be delayed as briefing slots are missed or briefs are returned for more work. Months can quickly become compounded into years. This necessarily raises the entire procurement process and how to avoid delays historically encountered in major capital projects of this size. It is important for the Royal Canadian Navy to manage the entire process, even though as the project sponsor, the Commander RCN will not have total control. Success in previous projects, specifically the Canadian Patrol Frigate, can be directly attributable to a consistent and sustained effort by the naval leadership of at least 8 successive MARCOM commanders to avoid process delay. So, in addition to surviving at least 5 federal governments, it must remain a top overriding priority for the incumbent commander of the RCN throughout the process. The latter point is significant because in Canadian defense procurement, there are a number of important factors to consider, as the government, in particular the bureaucracy that supports the government of the day, must be sold on the requirement and its affordability. Submarines are expensive to operate, and in early, inaccurate, and rough acquisition and support cost estimates can be detrimental to long-term government program support if costs are seen to be escalating out of control. As we have seen, selling submarines to the Canadian government has always been very difficult, and the fiscal conditions of a post-pandemic economy are not optimal. Moreover, if the cost of a replacement submarine capability risks displacing the planned force mixture of the surface fleet, our history has shown that may lack support from within the RCN itself. This slide is an estimate of timeline for initial project delivery based on historical data. Using open source data, I have arbitrarily selected an estimate of 8 years from commencement of construction to initial delivery, as this is currently achievable by some, not all, submarine building yards now. To be clear, the Canadian procurement process will demand a competition, And the result will most likely be bidders offering a version of an existing conventional submarine design, which is modified to meet Canadian requirements, accompanied by assurances of a timely build process for the initial tranche of submarines, and to undertake business activity in Canada in equal the value of the contracts they won. Okay, that's a bit of a mouthful, but this accurately describes a process that will be demanding and can allow for surprising results. At this stage, what weight various factors will have in a technical assessment has yet to be determined. Furthermore, in addition to pricing, how a bidder responds to the offset requirements could very well influence a tight competition. The recent PBO report analyzing contractor obligations under the Industrial Technological Benefits Policy, which was published in May this year, makes for sober reading. Specifically, it, quote, suggests that a supplier that proposes a lower value for money or a higher price could still be awarded a multi-million-dollar contract if it promises greater economic benefits to Canada, unquote. That said, it's clear if Canada is to replace the existing submarine capability without gapping it, then the solution will be found in a consortium marking a minimally modified existing conventional submarine design built in an experienced submarine building yard in conjunction with an experienced combat systems integrator. The shift to the threat to state-on-state warfare may have indeed made it easier to justify a renewal of Canada's submarine capability, but it must be realistic, in that it must be affordable and sustainable as part of a total Canadian defense solution. However, what is unknown at this time is how will submarines factor into the overall military force assessment against other priorities resulting from the dramatically changing international security situation. The bottom line is that notwithstanding recent international events, a replacement submarine project remains a big issue for the RCN, and history has shown it's not going to be easy. Finally, leading and managing a submarine replacement project will require sustained leadership and priority at the highest level of the RCN and government for a period of 20 to 25 years. The RCN now has an opportunity to drive a submarine replacement project through government, but it will be a challenging endeavor in a post-pandemic fiscal environment that is competing for resources with the other environments. In addition to unforecasted defense expenditures resulting from the crisis in Ukraine, there is a significant unknown cost of continental defense, which is becoming much more than NORAD renewal. And this is a must-do for any government, regardless of political ilk. But are submarines considered to be part of this requirement? Submarines are not something that captures a nation focused on social programs, and this is where the Naval Association can play an important role, as there is a need to educate Canadians not only why we need to maintain a submarine capability, but why we need to move on a replacement submarine project now. Ends my thing, and I'm open for any questions.
Thanks for that, Norm. That was an excellent overview of the history of submarines in Canada in the RCN, and certainly some very valid points made on the procurement process and the challenges ahead. We have a few questions. Barry, over to you for questions in the chat.
Thank you. I'll start off with a question from Mr. William Bernard Boothroyd. Do you see the RCN returning to the concept of an ASW-focused Navy with its area of operations being the Arctic? If not, where do you see the RCN's focus of operations shifting?
Well, I think the answer is we will go away and sort of substantiate the reason for a submarine capability based on domestic requirements. So yes, you'd say that's offer to coast and certainly the Arctic interests the Arctic archipelago from both sides. The reality, of course, we know that these submarines will be in service for probably about 40 years on that, and the government of Canada will respond to the crisis of the day, which historically has probably been somewhere on the other side of the world. And so the answer is you'll buy them for domestic reasons, but the government today will probably for expeditionary reasons. So the answer is, where's the focus going to be? It's going to be worldwide. Only thing we're going to say is it's going to be in blue water. So you're going to have legs to get where you're going, whether that's the Canadian North, off either coast of Canada. Take a look at a map. You'll see that once you get north of, you leave Esquimalt on the west coast or Halifax on the east coast, a whole lot of support as you go north. Or it could very well be forward deployed, as we saw with Chicoutimi out to the Asia Pacific for a time, or indeed out to the Mediterranean or up to the next. So that's what submarines give you. They give you that flexibility to go where you go, and the government of the day will use them as they see fit.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Based on your slide about deadlines leading to, quote, having a submarine, quote, is it right to think that strong, secure, and engaged policy statement and promise to replace the Victorias in the 2030s is impossible? Would 2040 be more realistic? And what needs to be done to get the submarines somewhere during the 2030s? And I guess the question that goes along with that is, can the acquisition timeline be reduced with an experienced overseas builder?
So great. First thing, strong, secure, engaged did not address a future submarine capability. All it did said, hey, we will maintain Victoria class to keep them going. What it did say is, which is very important, that it was focused on mainly from the Navy's perspective, the Canadian surface combatant, but to say, hey, no, we see a submarine capability, because they could have killed it off at that time. No, we're prepared to invest more money in the Victoria to maintain that capability, but it did not address a future submarine capability. So timelines, yeah, I think, you know, the timelines I gave you on that slide, and I'll just go back a bit. Let's see. I knew this was always going to think. The issue there is that's if you get your project all through those, you go through all these hoops here on time. Every time you go in there, you want to go into the brief saying, great, good, excellent, no questions, go next. The instant you got, come back next time, you lose time. That is going to get you into contract award, okay? That you've got to reduce down to a minimum. Any delays will be compounded. So it gets back down to this. This is based on a submarine builder. I took a look at them, and you know, I looked at Japan. They're delivering 52 months. Korea is delivering in 63 months. Italy's delivering in 79 months. Germany in 96 months. You know, so it is possible. These are experienced submarine builders that are their yards are set up to do this, and they know what they're doing. Okay, so that's the only way you're going to get timelines. That how to reduce that further? That's tough, because no one's got a surplus of submarines like we saw in the 60s, where we'll just give you some of our old ones. No one's got that. So the answer has got to be, you know, experienced submarine builder that can go away and say, yeah, I can build you that in this time frame. Because other than that, it's going to keep going right. And you take a look at, for example, the Spanish, they laid down the S-80 Plus in 2005. It's doing trials now, okay? These things are tough, okay? And ask anyone that builds submarines. These are tough things. So the answer is you've got to reduce, the only way you reduce timelines is reduce risk. How do you reduce risk? You go and experience submarine builder. And there's a lot in the world, but some of them won't do anything. They haven't got capacity. The United States Navy is, probably the United States of America is not going to build conventional submarines for Canada. Let it go. British are, their yard capacity is full up with Astutes going into their Dreadnought class SSBNs. You know, so where is the capacity in the yards? And that's where you're going to have to. And that's the only way you're going to, I think, address time. Keep it down. Keep any changes modest and go with it and sort it out later.
Thank you. The next question I have is relates to the comment that about Canada's relationship with a submarine force, that we are a navy that happens to have submarines versus a submarine navy. How do you change that mindset?
Well, it's a good question, and I'll be the for those that know me, I can be a cynical certainly. History has shown that we are, and that goes back, you know, let's face it, that goes back to Laurier. You know, destroyers and everything when the British wants us to buy dreadnought things. No, this is what we think. This is ingrained in us. And it's the only way Walter Hose could keep the thing going, saying, hey, keep a couple destroyers for thing and go into mobilization. Now, Harry DeWolf saw it. I mean, through the Second World War, we wanted tribal class destroyers. I mean, this is what it. The reason for that was, so when the war ended, they could, you know, if you got gifts, they could say, well, give them back. No. So they wanted something that was meaningful. How do we change that? You know, one thing about submariners is they've been in surface ships too. The thing about people that are only in surface ships, they may or may not, probably have never been in a submarine, so they don't understand, okay? And that's why people get a bit, when you see submariners want to go, because they understand. I always make a joke that in the Canadian Navy, it seems when you get promoted to flag rank, admirals have epiphanies and all of a sudden understand completely why we need submarines. Before, when they were not an admiral, they were somewhat skeptical. We need the education process. People got to understand this is what you're going to do. And by the way, there's a whole bunch of understandings. It's not just more than capability going out, what what a submarine will give you. It's also affordability. Remember Harry DeWolf's words. Okay, so what's the most expensive thing out of your defense budget? It's people. It's gone to almost 2/3 of the defense budget goes to personnel and training issues. By the way, it does for every Western nation. So how do you reduce crew sizes? Well, a 50-person crew versus a frigate of 4, that's substantial savings. But you got to have critical mass. You just can't have ones and twosies because everyone on board that 50-person crew is critical. So you need to have the critical masses sorted out and everything. So there's a sweet spot there where you can look at, hey, by going over there, it will make sense. We get meaningful contribution to things. We can do really good stuff. And on top of that, we can reduce our P-bill down, okay, and get a better return on our investment. Not at the expense of saying, hey, only submarines. But the answer is there's a balance there. And I would point to the Australians, okay, for a whole bunch of reasons, because they sort of come from where we came from. They look at the world the same way we do. They have a lot of the same problems. And notice the size of their surface fleet. Way back in 2009 said, we're going for 12 submarines. Everyone went, what's all that about? Well, it makes sense. Okay, you still have a surface fleet, but it's a bit more of a balance. And that's what needs to happen. But that's an education process. And the problem with that is government doesn't understand. The submarines, of course, are hard to articulate why, because every time you go out and patrol, that's classified. And you don't talk about that. So how are you supposed to tell what you did? Well, I can't talk to you about that. It's problematic, but we got to get more things out. And a few years ago, when Admiral Robertson was Chief of the Maritime Staff, he got the historical branch to write up a report, and that was subsequently declassified on some of the operations Canada's Oberons did in the 1980s. So it's an education process, and you got to go out and say what our guys do and what they can do. That's always going to be tough because you don't want to open your kimono too much, but at some point in time, you got to sell it to the Canadian populace too, that submarines are not just merchant ships being sunk by evil U-boat commanders, and there's still that thought process there. There's more to it than that.
Thank you. I think we've got time for one more question, so that people can do a little sand and face afterwards. But drawing together your previous questions about and comments about global role and options to buy off the shelf somewhere, there are other navies that are looking for an extended range SSK capability. And there's a select number of builders that are involved in some of those programs. But does an extended range SSK for those other nations, perhaps Japan, Australia, and the Netherlands, mean the same thing as what Canada is looking for?
Well, it all depends on what you're going to use it for and endurance. I would argue the Australians have similar sort of concerns. I mean, the transit from your base to where you're going to patrol. In the case of the Australians, if they're going from Perth, they're going to the South China Sea, it's a 2-week transit, okay? Canada, take a look at, if you want to go up from Halifax up to, Davis Strait up there, it's, let's say Nanisivik, okay? That's the same distance as going to Portsmouth, UK. And on the West Coast, it's just even huge. It's much bigger distances, to get around up there. So you need that. A lot of the submarine builders in this world, conventional submarine builders, are European. If you take a look at a map of Europe, they operate mainly in the Baltic, North Sea, and in the Mediterranean. Their access to support infrastructure, particularly things like liquid oxygen for AIP, they can be in any port in hours or weeks. So this is why there ain't that many out there that are building conventional submarines of that displacement. And the actual fact is, who's building a conventional submarine of greater than 3,500 tons, conventional submarine? And the answer right now, really only 2 nations. That's Japan and Korea, okay? But again, where are their patrol areas? What do they do? What do they need it for? That's the sort of thought. That's what the Australians were looking at with the attack class submarines. But even so, it's, how do you get to the thing? So endurance is big for a Canadian submarine. So that's why big displacement. Now, can a submarine builder build that? I'm sure they can. The question is, how much risk is there if you've never built a submarine over such and such a displacement? You know, there's nations out there. I mean, I would never ever say the Germans, you know, you can't build a submarine. I think they got a pretty formidable history of that. You know, the Italians do very well by building designs on license. The Swedes are doing good. Remember, the Swedish design was for the Collins class Australian. That's a 3,300 ton submarine. So they've designed it. It's all about who can build in that in combination with designer. So yeah, you need the legs. Not many people out nations in the world do that, other than the people that build nuclear submarines. Okay, fine, but those countries that are building nuclear submarines are probably not, either don't have the capacity. I'd say, with the exception of the French, maybe don't have the capacity to build anything else. Okay, and I'm assuming that we're not buying Chinese or Russian. So you know, that's the sort of thing. So it is a by necessity a very small club out there where you can go. So Canada's in that position. I think that answers the question, does it not?
I certainly thought it did, Norm. And certainly I want to thank you for your comments this morning and your answers to the questions. I think you really got the ball rolling here this morning with some of your comments, and particularly your answers in a number of areas that I'm sure we're going to come back to later in the day. But I want to press on and keep on schedule. So we've just hit 10 o'clock, and I will now ask Adam Lajeunesse and Tim Choi to get ready to start their presentation on Northern and Arctic operations. Tim, I see you are up on the screen. Over to you.
I think Adam's starting this, so Adam, are you on?
I hope he hasn't stepped away, but
No, sorry about that, folks. Just setting up the screen share. Can everyone see the title page of the presentation now?
Yep.
Yes.
Excellent.
Okay, I'm
Great.
going to mute now.
All right. Thank you, Tim. And thanks to the NAC for having us today. So what Tim and I are going to do is we're going to cover the Arctic component of this. We're going to look at the under ice capabilities of submarines. We're going to look at the strategic value of operating in the north, because while the Arctic is very much Canada's third ocean in terms of historic RCN priorities, it is always one of the first considerations when we're looking at submarine programs, in large measure because the Arctic is a region that submarines are uniquely capable of accessing, and historically have been the only asset able to reach certain components, certain areas of the Arctic. So what we're going to cover today is a quick look at the emerging strategic value of the North. We are going to look at how that strategic situation has very strong echoes to the Cold War, what Canada's its strategy was during the Cold War, how that applies today, and what a Canadian conventional submarine can contribute to a more holistic understanding of North American under ice defense. So with that, I'll let Tim kick us off.
Okay. Well, thanks everyone. So we're going to start off with sort of where Norm started off his presentation, with highlighting the growing sort of Russia and Chinese shipbuilding programs, or their conflicts with the West in a broad sense, and really highlight some of the nitty-gritty sort of details that's happening in the submarine realm at this time. And so, you hear a lot about how Russia is building a massive fleet of submarines, and to some extent that is true. I think it's definitely going a lot longer, much more backing, much more consistent support than their surface fleet. However, that's not to say they're doing this without any particular problems. So, one of their newest attack submarines, the Severodvinsk here, was they laid us down in the early 90s, and they only finished it, just a couple of years ago, and they just put it into service a little shortly after that. And to the extent that Russia has actually, recovered a bit from its immediate post-Cold War demise, and to make all the sort of new shipbuilding programs happen. Well, we see in Ukraine the massive sanctions are taking drastic cuts on its military programs, and so we see this a lot with their sort of tank production. There were recent articles about how they can't actually build any tanks because of those sanctions, but we don't know exactly how that'll impact their submarine and shipbuilding programs. Now we know that after their invasion of Ukraine in 2014, they lost access to Ukrainian turbines that were vital for the surface fleet. There was less of an indication that this affected their submarine fleets, and so during the last several years, they have been commissioning a couple more of these Yasen class SSGNs, as well as, of course, their Bore class SSBNs. And those things, I don't see any signs that they're slowing down. If anything, they'll probably speed up a bit as they get more efficient and they settle on a finalized design that they're actually happy with before commencing full rate production. But of course, as far as Canada and the Arctic is concerned, the issue is less about submarines being, the traditional, interdiction of transportation assets. So it's less about them sinking transportation vessels, less about them sinking convoys and the warships escorting them, but more about them as a kind of power projection tool against the North American continent. And the current thinking in D&D is, I think, especially to help justify why we need a increase in better NORAD apparatus, is the concern that Russia or China might decide to engage in the sort of a conventional limited strike on North American staging grounds before we can provide support or assistance to areas closer to Russia or Chinese core strategic areas. And so that's sort of the thinking here. And so what are the Russian or Chinese land attack capabilities? And a lot of that has been focused on the emergence of new hypersonic technologies, extra fast missiles and go Mach 5 plus to strike you before you have the time to react. This partly due to maneuverability in the atmosphere, so you can't detect them as far of a range as ballistic missiles can, and of course they can, as far as hypersonic cruise missiles are concerned, they can to a limited extent sort of hug the ocean a little bit, and really reduce your detection time. And so you see here in this image on the right is the Yasen class, the same one you see on the left there in port, and you can see it launching one of the Zircon anti-ship missiles. It's one of the much touted hypersonic anti-ship cruise missiles. And of course, anti-ship cruise missiles aren't necessarily the best options for use against land targets, although we do see that being used in Ukraine right now. So, if you're desperate, they can be used for that, although, very, very pricey. But nonetheless, we do see the Russians, actively engaging in testing of hypersonic attack missiles from the latest generation of nuclear-powered submarines. And so that is a thing that's occurring now. And, the Russians are planning to build 10 of these Yasen-class SSGNs. And how many of those will actually get completed with the ongoing sanctions, we're not quite sure, but it's something that we cannot put to the side. As for China, their nuclear-powered submarine fleet is not being built nearly as fast as their surface fleet. And so, in terms of what people or the West is concerned with right now, is less the SSN or SSGN threat and more about the surface fleet. That being said, China has recently built a brand new construction yard dedicated to just nuclear-powered submarines. And although we haven't seen them produce anything yet, it's clearly just beginning in that regard. And over the last several years, they've been working on various iterations of their SSNs and SSBNs to, optimize for the best sort of configurations of the hull forms and technologies involved. So you can expect, once they settle on a desired design, that they're, engaged in the same kind of rapid and high quantity construction production rates that we see with their surface fleet. And so that's something we can't really ignore. Now, as for the Chinese cruise missiles, they're not quite as advanced as the Russian state of affairs. They're going to need, they haven't really tested any kind of extra long range attack missiles. So at this point, there is no particular concern about them hitting vital targets in North America unless they get really close where they're extra vulnerable to detection. Nonetheless, of course, missile technologies develop quickly, and we can probably expect that this relatively favorable position right now to no longer be the case in around 10 to 15 years' time. So next. So here are some of the current and soon to be current missiles that we're thinking about. So usually when you talk about missile ranges, you position your range circle starting from where the launcher is. But in this case, I'm doing it backwards. I'm looking at where some of our major targets are, and then what is the minimum distance required for an attacking submarine to be in order to attack us. And so the three major targets I've selected here are going from west to east, Vancouver, Winnipeg, and Ottawa. I choose Winnipeg because it's a major NORAD site for command and control, and of course Ottawa for obvious reasons, and Vancouver just to finish out the west. So starting we're gonna actually start with with the three red circles. Barry, I think you have your mic on. If you can mute that, that'll be very appreciated. Thank you. So you see the three red circles represent the current, state of the art for Russian land attack cruise missiles, and that's the 3M14, the caliber missile with a range of roughly 2,500 kilometers. And so you see in those red circles where they have to be to hit each of those three cities. And you can see that the Arctic, is well within, the areas which they can launch. So we can expect a Russian submarine, if they decide to conduct some sort of strike against those vital targets, or really anywhere within Canada, that if they were to sneak into Hudson's Bay, much like we thought they would in the Cold War, as Adam will talk about, that is a perfectly good place for them to engage in that kind of attack. And now for the hypersonic missiles that I mentioned earlier, look at the green circles there, and it's a much shorter range weapon. The hypersonics, because of the high speeds and the limited size, they don't have the same amount of range capacity. So roughly 1,000 kilometers is what they're tested for. Maybe they can go a bit farther. We're not sure. But obviously, if you're using those, they have to sneak. As far as the Arctic is concerned, one of those hypersonic missiles can only be launched from well within James Bay over there in the southern tip of Hudson's Bay. So the relationship between hypersonic missiles and the Arctic is less of a concern for us at this point than it is for the more conventional subsonic cruise missiles like the Calibers. And Russians are apparently working on an even longer range version of the Caliber, the so-called Caliber M, which has received development funding to 2027. So we can expect sometime after that they might be put into service. And with that's the mauve kind of color, the purple-pink circle that you see, with roughly 4,000 kilometers of purported range, and that allows them to hit us from pretty much shortly after they leave port in the Arctic, assuming they're surfaced. So that is where the real Arctic attack vector might come in a kind of realistic sense. So those are sort of the the immediate and the near future time frame for the kind of missile attacks and ranges that we have to be concerned about. And at this particular point in time, the new generation of cruise missiles isn't a real concern. Rather, is the existing sort of the missiles that can already be used against us, but they have to get within that kind of a range that we're talking about here, pretty close to the southern bit of the Arctic and of course the Atlantic coast. So with that covered, I'll turn to Adam about sort of is any of this new, particularly in Canadian discourse?
Oh, thanks so much, Tim. It's a great overview. And it leads very nicely into the history of this subject because, of course, we've been here before. So the main concern that is coming out of NORAD, NORTHCOM these days, and this new concern over North American continental defense relates in large measure to these emerging Russian and theoretically also Chinese threats. Now, the fact of the matter is the late Cold War period saw these very same threats emerge. In the late 1970s, certainly into the 1980s, this was the main concern. This was what pushed American SSNs into the north at a much higher rate of operations. This is what really inspired the 1987 Canadian Defence White Paper to advance the notion of building Canada's own SSN fleet. So it was this concern over then Soviet cruise missiles, which were then fairly new, giving the Soviet Union a first strike nuclear capability, the ability to strike targets across North America with cruise missiles to circumvent NORAD's warning system. Now today, as Tim mentioned, you've got the hypersonic element, but you've got more than that. If you read some of the more recent papers coming out of NORAD scholars, it's not just the nuclear threat that is first and foremost in front of their minds, but now there is this risk of a conventional strike. The idea that these long-range cruise missiles can be used to escalate, to de-escalate, to strike North American nodes of communication and infrastructure for deploying North American forces overseas. The Arctic can be a firing location for conventional weapons, which are more likely to be used in combat than their nuclear equivalents. So this is a brand new element, the conventional element, but the threat of cruise missiles and the threat of Soviet and now Russian submarines operating in the north, goes back quite a ways. The Arctic, however, brings a different element to considerations of submarine deployments. As I mentioned when I introduced us, the sovereignty question is always first and foremost, at least at the political level, at least when submarine programs are being sold. And we saw this in 1987 when Canada attempted to procure a fleet of SSNs. Now, those submarines were primarily designed for security operations in the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean. However, what's really interesting is how they were sold to the public. What was that political element? And of course, the Arctic, even though the Arctic was not a primary security consideration, despite what the Soviets were doing, the Arctic was right out there, front and center in the publicity campaign. When the Mulroney government was trying to convince Canadians that these were necessary, they were important, the Arctic was out there front and center. A big part of that was because, of course, the 1980s saw a major sovereignty crisis with the American icebreaker USCGC Polar Sea transiting the Northwest Passage in 1985, created a crisis and several years of negotiation over American recognition or lack thereof of the Northwest Passage. So it stands to reason that this political issue, which remains unresolved to the present day, is going to continue to frame our understanding of what submarines do in the Arctic and why we need them. And in the 1980s, it framed this understanding by allowing the Mulroney government to sort of pitch sovereignty as one of the reasons that we need submarines. And the reason he did that was obvious, not only because it worked, but because his government was getting flack from across the political spectrum during the Polar Sea crisis and thereafter. And so this was one of the tools that he could deploy to show that the government was doing something, that the government was being reactive. And often politicians, media, even academics fail to really understand what sort of contributions submarines can really make in the Canadian Arctic. Criticizing Mulroney at the time, Jean Chrétien once accused him of cronyism to the Americans because of the Polar Sea and the lack of a forceful government response, telling Mulroney that he went on his knees all the time to Reagan, which was obviously some kind of religious reference. I don't know what else it could be. But there's that political element, that demand that we defend not only Canadian security from Soviets and the Russians, from this growing threat, but we defend our political position, we defend our sovereignty and our national rights, even from our greatest friends, which is the Americans in the Arctic. So what I want to talk about is the reality is so much different than a lot of that political rhetoric. And when we're looking at the strategic value of submarines in the North, and when we're looking at what they're ultimately going to do, we got to make sure that we are keeping in mind the difference between that political rhetoric of defending sovereignty and defending ourselves from the insidious Americans who are sneaking into our Arctic from the reality. And the reality is that since the Cold War and there afterwards, the Arctic has been defended. The under ice environment has been defended in a very, very collaborative framework where Canada works with the Americans, regardless of all that conversation about sovereignty. So here's a great map that I pulled out of the US archives. It's in a couple books I've published. This is American submarine transits in the Arctic region up to about the mid-1950s. What's really fascinating, of course, is you look at the Northwest Passage and Canadian Arctic waters. There's a great deal of activity. Only three of those voyages are technically declassified, but you can see there's about 8 different voyages that we know of up to the mid-1980s. And almost all of those, there's 2 exceptions, but almost all of those were undertaken with Canadian cooperation, with Canadian knowledge, organized through the Permanent Joint Board of Defense. An operation in 1977 was at the request of Canada. And in fact, one of the primary missions of all of these voyages was testing Canadian under ice detection systems. And so we need to shift our understanding of how under ice defense has historically been undertaken. This is not a need for Canada to deploy north to protect its Arctic politically from the Americans. Under ice detection has always been, under ice defense has always been this cooperative endeavor where Canada and the United States bring capabilities and assets and resources that each party has into this sort of collaborative North American focused maritime defense system. So over the 1970s, over the 1980s, what was happening was the two were working together in a kind of unofficial maritime NORAD, with American-backed Canadian detection systems being frequently tested against American submarines, with the understanding that this still prototype system or systems would ultimately feed into a broader, bilateral or binational, complete North American situational awareness picture. That was always the idea, and this went over decades. This cooperative relationship was taking place during the 1969 sovereignty crisis surrounding Manhattan. It was taking place during the 1985 sovereignty crisis during Polar Sea. In fact, as the Polar Sea was moving through and Reagan and Mulrooney were facing the slings and arrows of public media, you actually had behind the scenes continuing cooperation that year on American submarine operations. So it has a history of a great deal of collaboration. The Canadian position in the North has never been to defend the region and the region's sovereignty against the Americans. That's often pitched as political rhetoric. The reality is, if we are going to deploy submarines, if we are going to deploy systems into the Arctic, it's got to be in partnership with the Americans and with our allies. That's the way it's always been done. And there's really no conceivable way to do this in the 21st century in any different way. It's got to be in partnership. So this defense organization, it's never siloed. It's always been that partnership. Give you a quick idea of what we had done in the 70s, 80s, and we've started to rebuild this capability over the last 10-ish years. Detection systems in Wrangell Bay, Grise Fiord, and Resolute. These were sort of the centers of Canadian detection work. All of these worked in partnership with American allies. American technology was used, American technicians working with the Defense Research Board. This is a 40-year-old partnership. So with that, I'll turn it back to Tim to talk about how do we build this North American collaborative system with submarines over the next 20 years going forward.
Thanks, Adam. Well, maybe I might not talk about the collaborative aspects so much. And sorry not to goose you a little bit here, but what I'm going to address now is actually turn to a concern that a lot of people have is, of course, climate change and its impact on the melting ice pack, right, or ice cap up in the north. And seeing these two images, the summer and the winter images of the retreating sea ice up in the Arctic. And there are a lot of questions, a lot of expectations that this means, of course, a dramatic increase in at least surface traffic to help exploit resources or as a means of transportation to reduce shipping route times and all that. But what does this mean for submarine operations, right? Because if we're talking about the Arctic, then obviously working under ice is a major issue, and the ability to operate under ice is a major concern that really dictates a lot of the design requirements for our submarines, or really anyone's submarines. If you need to work under the ice, you need to have extra large sizes so you can punch through the ice. You need to have extra long endurance and all that. And so looking at where the ice is, what does that mean for potential adversaries' postures in the region? That's an absolutely vital part of the task. And so here I'm going to reference a little bit of some of the work that I've been doing with that think tank that was mentioned in the beginning, BASIC, British American Security Information Council, under a project funded by D&D. And it's really looking at the impact of the retreating sea ice and what does this mean for Victoria-class modernization, its replacement, and with relationship to the Russian SSBN situation. So as we know, ever since the later part of the Cold War, the Russians have made the Arctic sea ice as part of a fundamental part of their nuclear second strike. That's where they hide their SSBNs, just to make it a lot harder for surface and aerial assets to hunt them. Meanwhile, the ice itself provides quite a bit of protection against other submarines just because of the complexities of the under ice environment. The underside of sea ice isn't flat. It's a whole bunch of different, continually compressed and stretched and, pressed ice that reaches multiple dozens of meters down underneath the water in sort of a jungle, an underwater jungle of sorts. And that really makes it hard for sonars to work, especially in active mode. Meanwhile, there's a whole bunch of different salinity levels that have to be continually measured and adjusted for. And so the under ice environment is incredibly difficult from an ASW perspective. It's incredibly difficult for submarines themselves operating alone up in the Arctic to carry out their tasks. And so as the sea ice retreats, though, we can expect that the Soviet or Russian SSBNs will continue to stay with that sea ice. But as we also know, the sea ice on the Russian side is retreating much, much quicker than it is on the Canadian side. And that's just because a lot of it's due to Beaufort Gyre and the trans-Arctic transpolar current. So a lot of the ice, as it melts, it tends to get pushed over into the Canadian side of things, meaning that our side of the Arctic is where the sea ice will last the longest into the future. And so what does that potentially mean? It means that the Russian SSBNs will follow the ice and they'll get closer and closer to the Canadian and American side of the Arctic. And so that raises the question of, well, should we do something about that? Because, of course, these SSBNs, they may be stationed occasionally under the ice, but when they do so, they're also protected by Russia's own SSNs, right? Their own attack submarines. And obviously, if you're going to protect an SSBN asset, then you're going to need to place your SSN somewhere in between the SSBN and potential adversaries, like those American submarines that come sailing through R and the Bering Strait. So that means that even though the SSBN might stay relatively close to the Russian side of the sea ice, that SSN protecting it might get fairly close to our side as part of that protection task. And so that raises another question then, well, for a Canadian submarine capability, do we need something up there to help monitor that and, if necessary, interdict that SSN that's sneaking around up there, probably within our EEZ? Of course, this is especially important too because it really throws in question about the utility of a diesel-electric submarine simply patrolling at the edges of the sea ice and at particular choke points on the way through to the Arctic. Because if the whole choke point operational expectation or image is that an enemy submarine will come in from the south where there are those choke points, whether it's the Davis Strait or the Bering Strait. But if what I'm proposing earlier about the retreating sea ice and the SS bands following it is correct, then those Russian submarines are going to come in from the north. They're going to come in from the side where there is no choke point. And at that point, then, a tactical sort of envision for Canadian SSK to simply monitor entries and exits to and from the Arctic from the south, that is not a particularly likely scenario. And so that really throws into question then, well, are SSKs sufficient? What if we need to have, we do need to spring for SSN capability to help address that sort of northern threat from the northern direction and not just from, choke points that are conveniently located to the south. Next. So one of the proposals is, of course, in terms of our future submarine fleet, is to lean hard into the whole air-independent propulsion technology for a non-nuclear submarine. And some people say, well, we need SSNs in order to break through the ice. Well, no, it's not so much the nuclear power that's required to break through the ice. Rather, it's the size of the submarine, is that mass that you have behind you as you surface under the ice that allows you to punch through. And we see this exemplified during our brief dalliance with the nuclear submarine acquisition project in the 80s that Norm mentioned. One of the candidates for that was the French Ruby class SSN, but that was too small. It literally had to be increased in size and strengthened in sail to meet Canadian requirements to work through the ice. And so it's not really about nuclear power, it's about the size of the submarine. And so we're going to be talking about, as Norm mentioned, that long-range expeditionary sort of submarine, but that size is also necessary in order for a submarine to push itself up through the ice. So that's one aspect of it. But of course, the bigger, because AIP, this air independent propulsion technology, it requires its own fuel, then the submarine that's larger can also naturally carry more of that air independent fuel. And this is especially important because when you're looking at all the sort of the brochures and the advertisements from various SSK manufacturers advertising their own AIP technologies, they'll say, oh, it can operate underwater for gives you 3 weeks or maybe 6 weeks or something like that. But they never really tell you under what conditions, right? They never really tell you what's the speed, what's the profile, what's the power consumption of that that secondary fuel source while you're doing all these things. And so we really have to keep in mind, have to think about, well, how quickly are we going to work through that fuel under ice, and what happens when we exhaust that fuel. And as Norm mentioned, we don't have a plethora of refueling stations up in the north for, in case they do run low on that AIP system. So I choose here, the SAB, the new A26 class submarines, and of course they're also touting an extra long version here, the extended range version, which is probably what would interest Canada the most, just from both a perspective of, increased size allows you to punch through more ice, and also from that expeditionary aspect, go across oceans. And so, you'll have, it's planned to have, vertical launch systems for cruise missiles and all the like, to really give us that power projection capability. But really, as mentioned, these are not yet built. The core vessels, they're in construction, but the extended version are not being ordered by anyone. And so if we were to get one, we'll sort of be the only ones operating them. And, that comes with its own challenges. And yet that's, if we want an under ice capability, that's sort of what we basically have to look at, is that extra large conventional submarine that allows you to have both, a payload capacity for cruise missiles and possibly underwater vehicles as well, but also have the size and endurance to work under the Arctic and under the sea ice. And, and so the idea of a smaller coastal sort of submarine that only needs to operate at the choke points to the Arctic close to the south of Canada, well, that's not really sufficient if what we mentioned earlier about the Russians coming in from north holds true. Next. And so we talked a bit about monitoring the water space up north, from our own perspective and be able to interdict vessels as needed. But one of the other strategic purposes of, having a submarine in our waters or in other countries' waters is simply to be part of NATO's water space management, their own ability to share in the general picture of where submarines are located in and around our waters. And so a sharp example of what happens if you don't do this was in, I think, around 2009, when two SSBNs, a French and a British submarine, they both collided in the middle of the Atlantic in a 1,000 to 1 situation, because obviously there are certain similarities in water spaces that are very favorable for submarine operations. But when you don't deconflict because you're not part of the same organization, then you result in collisions like this, which is quite problematic. And shortly afterwards, I think within a month, the French president at the time, rapidly re-added France to the NATO military command, presumably to regain access to the information as to where Allied submarines are roughly located, so that this doesn't happen again. And so this is we're already in NATO, but if we don't have a submarine capability, then we don't need that information about what's happening underneath our waters. And so even just maintaining some kind of submarine capability, even at a very nascent level, still allows us to be part of this information management regime, and allows us to have a lot more sovereignty over what's happening in our waters than if we didn't have that. So that's my part.
Thank you, Tim. Yeah. So just to sum up essentially what we have been talking about for the last 20 minutes, what we're seeing from the Russians primarily, in fact, and from the Chinese as well, at least on paper in some of their defense colleges, is an increasing interest and reliance on the Arctic. The Russians in particular are sending more submarines into the region. The Americans have already reacted to this. And of course, if we are going to continue to be part of continental defense with the US, Canada is going to need to re-engage not just on the aerospace, but also the maritime component of North American defense as well. So what that means is going to remain to be seen. We're going to see what comes through from the Defense Review, but it will have to include some kind of increased focus on underwater and under ice detection and interdiction, a capability that needs to be integrated with the United States to give Canada not only that security presence and an ability to defend its own waters, but to give Canada a seat at the table, that presence in our own continental defense. So how that unfolds, again, remains to be seen, but I think we have at least a fairly good idea right now of the basic capabilities that are going to be needed both at the political and the strategic level. And I think we've got 25 minutes left for questions, which is great, and I'll turn it back to you, Norm, to moderate those. Or Barry, pardon.
Actually, it's Barry. Thank you. I just want to relay one comment from Captain Navy retired Phil Webster. Phil, it's nice to have you here joining us today. Phil says that one of the major reasons that Canada was informed of U.S. submarine deployments in the Arctic was because of the water space management system. And without submarines, the USN would not have informed us of these deployments. And so knowing about them was an important operational argument used when justifying the Upholder acquisition.
That's great. Thank you for that additional information on that. So yeah, thanks for really supporting our points.
Okay. A comment from Lee Carson, or a question actually. Thanks for the overview of Arctic submarine missions. Has anyone done any study of which missions are possible by uninhabited submarine vehicles and which absolutely require to be manned? Or so I guess he's really asking is there a trade-off in there?
Well, the issue with autonomous vehicles is control. So we are increasingly seeing phenomenal ranges coming out of some companies. I think Kraken, for instance, is running UAVs with 1 or 2,000 mile range. Don't quote me on that, but the phenomenal ranges. But questions of control, you need artificial intelligence to steer it if something goes wrong or if there's ice where you didn't expect there to be ice. So it's very difficult to communicate with a UAV that is underwater unless you're willing to pop it up to the surface and poke an antenna out. Now, that being said, there is a lot of at least industry experimentation going on with this right now and a lot of potential, but often the two are paired together. The idea is not a UAV operating autonomously, but rather with a manned, a crewed submarine, which can communicate with it more easily than, say, a distant ground station to provide it with instructions and receive information back from it. Tim?
Yeah. And to build on that, there are a lot of experiments right now. There's some companies who are advertising a number of underwater stations where these UUVs can communicate via a high frequency short range acoustic means, high frequency and short range to maintain that sort of stealth profile. But these stations have to be placed in a fairly high regular frequency just so you can be able to maintain continuous communications with that UUV. But unfortunately, a lot of these technologies, they don't really have the Arctic in mind. And what I mean by that is that yes, you can put all these sensors and communication relays on a seabed, but then you come into problems with icebergs. And we know that icebergs carve massive gouges at the bottom of the seabed, especially in the very shallow waters of the Canadian Arctic. And so, the maintenance cost of continuously repairing or replacing these underwater stations to maintain that UUV practicality, that might become very prohibitive indeed, and will not be really all that feasible to implement. Now, and so that really brings us to the discussion on uncrewed versus autonomous, right? So you have an uncrewed vehicle. Well, that can range from anything. Technically, a torpedo is an uncrewed vehicle, but how much direct control do you have over its direct activities? You can have a UUV that operates sort of like in your standard aerial drone, where you have continuous line of control with that vehicle. But obviously, as Adam mentioned, that command control capability is much more difficult when you're working underwater, and even more so when you're under ice, because you don't have regular access to the atmosphere. And so that's where the autonomous aspect really kicks in, is to reduce the requirements to communicate back with land authorities in either one or two-way fashion. And so that would require a substantial amount of investment in artificial intelligence, and of course a very robust set of ROEs to make sure that these underwater vehicles are doing what we expect them to do in every single conceivable scenario, and in order for them to be effective. And so and then if you're leaving them to just operate autonomously and with very limited ability to communicate their findings back with us, then how useful are they really, right? Because you can have them sailing around and try to track down enemy submarines, but but we're never going to let them, have an autonomous ability to, destroy the enemy submarine. So, they're just following an enemy submarine, but they can't actually do anything. They can't even tell us where they are because they can't send communications back through the ice up to the satellite. Then what real purpose is having a UUV capability in that regard? Now, obviously, that's not the only scenario where UUVs might be used. You can use them in areas with low amounts of sea ice or no sea ice at all. And they can, if launched from a crewed submarine, then obviously they can feed that information back to that submarine using wire like a torpedo, to help extend the range of the submarine sensors, much as the current Mark 48s can sort of do. So there is that kind of capability that can be incorporated in a your standard crewed submarine, but there are also limitations to how much autonomy are we willing to let them in order for them to take advantage, in order for us to take full advantage of that uncrewed capability.
Thanks for that, Tim and Adam, and thanks for your responses to questions so far. I see a few more that have come in while you've been talking. Barry, could we perhaps go back to one that was posted back at about 10:19 this morning from Bill Wood. Do you see that one? I'll ask it. Um, could you clarify what you mean when you talk about sovereignty? In Australia, an Australian sovereign capability was a big political aim, but then there was a huge debate about what you had to do to claim that it was sovereign.
Sure, and that's an important question to ask because the two don't often mesh. It's the security element and the sovereignty element. So Canada's sovereignty dispute, in fact, the only one left, having solved Hans Island, is the difference of agreement between Canada, the United States, and on the American side, some other countries as well, over the status of the Northwest Passage and the waters within Canada's Arctic archipelago. Canada holds them to be historic internal waters, meaning they're ours, every bit as Canadian as a lake is Lake Winnipeg, whereas the United States believes that waters outside 12 nautical miles are international with an international strait running through the Northwest Passage. So it's a legal disagreement. And the operations of American icebreakers have historically brought this to the surface, even when the two political sides didn't want to fight. So in the 1980s, what emerged was an attempt to use a security tool to demonstrate dedication to resolving the sovereignty dispute or defending Canadian sovereignty. It's never spelled out how a Canadian submarine influences a legal dispute. Quite frankly, it doesn't really. However, knowledge of what is happening in the Northwest Passage and Canadian waters does probably buttress Canadian legal claims because we want that knowledge. We want to demonstrate that we are aware of what's happening within our own internal waters. That doesn't necessarily have to happen with a siloed Canadian submarine capability, though. That's important. It's a big part of it. But building ourselves into a broader North American defense system where that information comes in through water space management or through bilateral relations with NORAD with the United States, that works as well. So the sovereignty component is there. It's a layer, but what I would caution people not to do is to blow it out of proportion and to see it as in some way solvable through the application of military force.
Thanks for that, Adam. Barry, do you want to go to the next one as you see them?
Have we lost Barry?
Okay, I'll pose the next one. And we've got about 5 minutes before we're going to wrap this session up and go to the break. But the question is, how has the AUKUS announcement fed into Canada / the RCN debate thinking in the last few months? Has it fed into the submarine discussion in any way? Now, this is an interesting one, and I'm not sure if we have much information on that yet, but I'll turn it over to you, Adam.
I'll leave that to Tim because I actually don't have much to say on that. Nothing that I've seen.
Okay.
Yeah, no, it's fairly hush-hush as to how AUKUS affects our submarine procurement, but obviously it feeds into a lot of discussion of, how can we contribute to this? Are we able to add to this? A lot of people talk about how AUKUS is a broad spectrum sort of program that covers everything from, quantum computing to artificial intelligence to new advanced hypersonic cruise missiles and the like, and that the submarines are just, the icing on top. But of course, from the Australian standpoint, the submarine program was the core, the most fundamental part of the whole thing. It was $90 billion worth that they just had to, basically cancel and redo. So, there does, from an Australian perspective, they're losing their current submarine plan. They're planning a new one with, nuclear power ones that's going to take God knows how long, at least 1.5 decades, maybe 2 decades for the first SSNs to actually be built and put into service for them, if that's the path they actually choose. And in the meantime, they probably think about, well, maybe we need something else in the meanwhile, some sort of SSK interim capability. But nonetheless, they're in a situation where they really need this submarine replacement program to go forward as quick as possible. And so having Canadians join in, with our own lethargic procurement processes is probably the last things the Australians want. And so, people will, a lot of commentary earlier about how, Canada really dropped the ball and by not being a part of AUKUS or not being invited to join AUKUS because we're absent in the Indo-Pacific and we're not engaged anywhere near as much as we need to. It's like, yes, true, but a big part of it is also just that, our procurement needs are very different from the Australians in a great extent of it. And so, they don't really need yet another cook in the kitchen to try to, throw our weight around and influence that already very lengthy procurement process that the Australians are engaging in. So that's just my comment for now as to, whether Canada is influenced at all by AUKUS. And, maybe a bit, but at the same time, I think the fundamental question of can we afford nuclear subs, that the calculus is pretty much the same regardless of whether AUKUS had happened or not. The only thing that might affect that is that it shows that the Americans are more willing to share nuclear technologies now than it was earlier back in the 1980s. So
That's a good observation, Tim. Thanks for that. I think we got time just for one more question before we
And
break.
I got it, Tim. Thank you.
Okay.
Sorry, I was muted so that other people could go. But the question basically sums up in, if we're going to talk about nuclear submarines, how do we get over the Canadian perception that nuclear powered equals nuclear armed?
yeah, that's always a fun one to do, isn't it? Even the Australians are seeing this sort of challenge right now, and a lot of it was allayed to some extent. I mean, everyone knows that people will have this misconception, and that's why you see in a lot of press releases from the president's office, from prime minister's office, from the Americans, from the British, from the Australians, they all emphasize nuclear powered but not armed. Submarines. So everyone knows that this is a big public perception that needs to be overcome. On the other hand, how much does that public perception actually matter, right? Like, how much protests against nuclear subs will focus on the nuclear arm aspect versus the nuclear powered aspect. I think the two circles are very closely overlapping, and it will all eventually just come down to the general arguments about increased militarism or increased defense spending and opposition to those two particular ideas, and less so about the specifics of where the plutonium and uranium goes. The same people who are going to object to those things are the same people who object to just general increases in this sort of seemingly unnecessary capability. So
Yeah, I'm sorry, Tim. Yeah, I was to echo some of what Tim was saying. I think what we saw in 1987, the biggest killer of the SSN program, apart from the collapse of the Soviet Union, was the cost. It wasn't the nuclear element. That obviously made some headlines that had some role to play, but I think the same will be true today, and which is why we didn't really spend a lot of time talking about SSNs, because quite frankly, they're probably not possible based on cost and the complexity of the shore-based support systems. So what we need to be looking at are conventional vessels and how they can be integrated into that continental focus with the Americans looking to defend the Arctic.
Okay, thank
Okay.
you.
I think that's good, Barry. It's 10:52 by my chronometer, and time for a bio break. We'll come back at just after 11 o'clock. So please, strongly suggest you just leave your computer as it is, walk away from your desk, and we'll see everybody back at 11. Thanks. Yep.
We can hear you now, Jamie. You've had some intermittent network problems, so I think if you could start afresh,
Yep.
we'll see what happens.
Sure, I'll leave my camera off. Maybe that'll preserve some bandwidth. Um, Thank you. So I'm not sure where I cut out. So given Barry's advice, I'll start right from the top again. And I'd like to acknowledge the Naval Association of Canada for facilitating a really important discussion. We've seen in the past few months, um, really the world return to a period where the needs of the many dictate the needs of the few take precedence over the needs of the many, where brawn is becoming more important than brains, and really power and preparedness is forcing diplomacy to the back row. I'm really excited to be able to share my thoughts with you for the next few minutes, but I'd like to caveat it. These are Jamie's personal thoughts, certainly shaped by a naval career where I was able to hold submarine positions in every rank from lieutenant to naval captain, but also influenced by a posting to Canada's other four-star headquarters. I spent my last 3 years in uniform as a Deputy Director of Strategy, Policy and Plans at NORAD headquarters in Colorado Springs. And there I was able to watch, learn, and eventually participate in the effort to raise awareness and drive action for a long overdue overhaul of NORAD capabilities. A rather unique background which has shaped my perspective, and that's what I'd like to share with you over the next few minutes. Today, nearly 90% of all traded goods are carried across the world's oceans. Over 11 billion tons a year. To put that in perspective, 1.5 tons for every person on the planet. Canada's economy, prosperity, and very way of life are inextricably tied to the sea. The world's shipping lanes are the arteries of an integrated global economy connecting the world like no other time in history. As Canadians, we're rightly proud of our nation's role in helping to shape today's world and the role we play in continuing to protect those achievements while helping build a better future. However, the freedom and prosperity we enjoy today is not guaranteed. Each and every day, the men and women of Canada's armed forces protect Canada and promote peace and stability the world over. The Royal Canadian Navy, Canada's Navy, your Navy, does its part on the world's oceans near and far. Canada's ships and submarines work alongside our allies and partners around the world to preserve the free, unencumbered use of the sea. These actions protect our very way of life here at home. And make no mistake, submarines are critical to a modern, balanced Navy. Their stealth, persistence, and lethality bring capabilities and strategic options to government that no other platform can. When it comes to safeguarding the arteries of our integrated global economy, submarines are the ultimate guarantor. Now, if today's conference were to have happened 5 or 6 years ago, this introduction would likely be sufficient. A direct appeal to our prosperity, a hat tip to the influence of sea power on economics, and quite frankly, a rinse-repeat of many of the historical arguments given to support or defend submarine acquisition. But the world has changed. While all of these arguments are still perfectly valid, and indeed still important reasons for investing in submarines, framing the discussion solely through a Mahanian lens does little to convey the complexity of today's security environment. It stops short of discussing new, real, and unique to Canada threats. It stops short of fully describing the revitalized and increasingly important role for submarines in a globe made smaller by long-range conventional weapons, a defense problem made more difficult by an over-the-pole threat as well as a from-the-sea threat. If Canada wants to actively participate in its own defense, Canada must be able to contribute integrated, interoperable, and interchangeable with our American allies to its own defense along all three coasts, above, on, and beneath the ocean surface. North America's most difficult threats, threats meant to circumvent NORAD's northward-facing history, threats from the sea, are managed best by submarines. The world has plunged back into strategic competition between the superpowers, a competition where Canada is a neighbor, an ally, a geographic buffer, and, given our integrated infrastructure, a valid target to have an effect inside the United States. It's a competition where victory looks a lot like the status quo and where the pernicious effect of defeat will fundamentally change our way of life. As strategic competitors seek to undermine the liberal democratic world order and all of the peace and prosperity that we've enjoyed over the past 77 years, Canada stands to lose much. We cannot knowingly, willingly let this happen. Since the 16th of February 1815, when the United States Senate ratified the Treaty of Ghent, ending the War of 1812, Canada has only fought abroad. in the First and Second World Wars, Korea, Afghanistan, and a myriad of peacekeeping operations, our ability to get from Canada to where we were needed most was never really in question. Defending Canada's sovereignty at home is not something the average Canadian taxpayer can imagine. For over 200 years, we played the away game. We played it well, but no longer can we rely on expeditionary forces to contain hostilities in far-off lands. Over the past 2 decades, while we executed that exact strategy, concentrating on the capabilities, training, and tactics we needed to fight in failed and failing states, competitors invested, trained, and advanced their military capabilities. We remained focused on forward operations the way we always have. They focused on undermining our previously uncontested ability to move within and to deploy from North America. Advanced technology, substantive investment, and well-meaning treaties like Open Skies allow competitors to target our most critical infrastructure. Canada and the United States are no longer sanctuaries. We are not immune to conventional attack. Quite frankly, competitors have solved deterrence by geography. With that, our ability to conduct operations far from home is no longer a guarantee. Our ability to keep Canada safe solely by fighting abroad is gone. We live in a world where our very ability to deploy forces beyond our own borders can and will be contested. We are ill prepared for this reality, and to be perfectly candid, this is not some potential threat sitting on the drawing boards in Moscow or Beijing. These are fielded weapon systems used operationally and to devastating effect in Syria and the Ukraine. Paradoxically, the threat to Canadian soil likely comes as no surprise and a complete surprise to the average Canadian. Since the 29th of August 1949, when the Soviet Union detonated their first nuclear bomb, we've lived under the dark cloud of possible nuclear annihilation. However, we knew a nuclear attack on North America would be met in kind. Mutually assured destruction kept a fragile peace. What has changed is that we are now vulnerable to attacks below the nuclear threshold, from over the pole, as well as from ships and submarines in the Atlantic, Arctic, and Pacific Oceans. The threat axis is all around. An attack on North America is no longer a desperate suicidal act, but rather a valid strategy designed to erode public will, fracture alliances, undermine power projection capability, and create economic chaos. This is a widely publicized component of Russian strategic thought. To remain a relevant ally and partner, to continue to prosper from economic relationships, the foundation of which is our shared responsibility for North American security, we must modernize all of our defenses, including a robust RCN, on the surface and below. We must protect our ability to operate when and where we choose. Our adversaries' current and emerging capabilities have pushed our national psyche towards the base of Maslow's hierarchy. Where we were once worried about international esteem and exporting Canadian values, we must now turn to the more basic needs of safety and security. We live in the most complex security environment ever. We all know Canada and the United States have embarked on a long overdue effort to modernize the North American Aerospace Defense Command, a critical and necessary part of our shared defense. While this is absolutely necessary, the ability of competitors to strike from any point on the compass means that while necessary, a robust north-looking defense network will not, in and of itself, be sufficient. Without a technologically advanced, highly capable Navy, including a leading-edge submarine fleet, we risk recreating the Maginot Line. We risk creating a false sense of security based on insufficient or incomplete defenses. A modern, capable RCN on and beneath the surface is our best defense in all three of Canada's oceans. Canada has a rich, interesting, and somewhat unconventional submarine history. As Norm discussed earlier, our acquisition history is curious, to say the least. I characterize our acquisitions as a surprise for CC1 and CC2, a take it, don't leave it order from the government for Canada's H boats, a couple of rentals, and 2 consolation prizes. I say this somewhat tongue-in-cheek, and by no means should this be seen as dismissive of the incredibly talented and proficient submariners that have taken and continue to take Canada's submarines to sea. Quite frankly, they are amongst the best in the world. But this time, it's different. There is a threat, not some sort of nebulous threat that plays out in the depths of the world's oceans, but a threat from competitor submarines that can directly impact the lives of Canadians anywhere in the country, in their homes or in their offices today. There is a need, there is a threat, but we must move quickly. We can, indeed we must, get submarine acquisition right this time around. No rentals, no consolation prizes, no capability gaps. The submarines Canada needs, the submarines Canadians deserve, if we value safety and security. Already much has been written about what a future Canadian submarine might look like. I do not intend to recap that work, but rather offer a bit of a first principles assessment stemming from the three core capabilities of a submarine: stealth, persistence, and lethality. Stealth. After safety, nothing, absolutely nothing, is more important to a submarine than stealth. In a diesel submarine where nearly everyone and everything has a speed advantage, there is one simple rule: don't get caught. Stealth is survivability. Most people tend to think of stealth as simply a quiet submarine. That's too simplistic. Systems and quiet ancillary machinery are certainly important contributors to a quiet submarine, but there's so much more to being stealthy. Effective control systems and autopilots to keep depth in all types of weather, to minimize control surface transients that give a submarine away. More important is the ability to do this at periscope depth, to avoid broaching or exposing too much mast, and providing a non-acoustic detection opportunity to waiting radars or watching eyes. World-leading sensors and prediction tools are critical to understand the acoustic and electromagnetic environments. Minimal radar cross-sections for all masts, periscopes that can make sense of the surrounding environment quickly by day and night, and electrical generation, distribution, and storage capabilities that minimize the requirement to run generators and risk all types of counter detection. Stealth starts on the drawing board, but is only fully realized when a well-designed, well-built, and well-maintained submarine is in the hands of a well-trained crew. Canada's next submarine must have the stealth characteristics that provide acoustic advantage against the world's quietest submarines. This includes the sustained investment needed for through-life acoustic husbandry and an increasingly operational mindset of submarine maintainers. Persistence. Submarines surveil large areas of ocean and observe visually, electronically, or acoustically completely undetected. Where an aircraft can loiter for hours, an unsupported ship for days, a submarine can loiter and observe, alone and undetected, for weeks on end. When no one knows you are there, they don't match their behavior. You see truth. Submarines carry the fuel, rations, spare parts, and technical competencies needed for extended, unsupported missions. However, mission planning remains a series of compromises. How far to the mission area? How fast do I need or want to go? Do I have to remain covert the entire transit? Can I top up on fuel, rations, and spare parts prior to mission start? All of these factors will help determine how much of a submarine's precious fuel and rations will be used to get to the mission area, and hence define how long the submarine can conduct its mission. For Canadian submarines, almost everywhere is really, really far, even our domestic area of operations. As an example, Halifax to Faslane is about 2,400 nautical miles. Honolulu is about the same distance from Victoria. Halifax to Resolute Bay is 300 nautical miles further than both of these far more hospitable destinations. What we used to consider lengthy foreign deployments will be, for Arctic-capable submarines, routine domestic operations. Any future submarine program with Arctic aspirations must build submarines with the range to get to the Arctic, operate for a reasonable period of time, and return home. To put that in perspective, at a not very covert transit speed of 7.5 knots, it would take 30 days in transit time for a trip from Halifax to Resolute Bay and back. Alternatively, any RCN Arctic facility could, perhaps should, have the ability to support submarines, an approach that would open the door to a wider range of design options and potentially lower program cost. Lethality. A submarine's lethal capability is unmatched by anything else at sea. A single heavyweight torpedo can destroy a ship or submarine, and in an age of small navies, small fleets, and tight defense budgets, the risk presented by a single submarine's absence from imagery can change how governments choose to employ maritime power. One need only consider the retreat of the Argentinian Navy to its territorial waters after HMS Conqueror sunk the cruiser Belgrano during the Falklands War 40 years ago last month. As Admiral Sandy Woodward, a submariner, noted in his book 100 Days, The Memoirs of the Falklands Battle Group Commander, what no one knew then was that Christopher Rayford Brown's old Mark 8 torpedoes, appropriately as old in design as the Belgrano herself, had sent the Navy of Argentina home for good. Unwittingly, we had achieved at least half of what we had set out to do from those days at Ascension. We had made the Argentines send out their fleet, and a single sinking by a British submarine had then defeated it. We would never see any of their big warships again. Of course, the combination of stealth, persistence, and lethality are just as attractive, if not more so, to our competitors. Submarines were a persistent focus of the Soviet Navy. Former Admiral of the Fleet of the Soviet Union and Commander-in-Chief of the Soviet Navy, Admiral Sergei Gorshkov, noted in his book, The Sea Power of the State, that submarine construction, and I quote, made possible in a very short time to increase sharply the strike possibilities of our fleet, to form a considerable counterbalance to the main forces of the fleet of our enemy, unquote. Today, just like 40 years ago, submarines carry an incredible anti-surface and anti-submarine punch. What has changed in the intervening years is the pairing of cruise missile technology with submarine persistence and stealth, creating a new dimension to submarine lethality. No longer are submarines conventional weapons limited to destroying ships and submarines. Critical infrastructure, economic centers, transportation nodes, and a host of other targets ashore are all potential targets for a cruise missile-armed submarine. As we've mentioned earlier, in Russia, the most modern cruise missile-armed submarines are those of the Severodvinsk class. In 2019, Pentagon officials told the news program 60 Minutes that the Severodvinsk, with its advanced quieting technology, had sailed into the Atlantic Ocean in 2018 and remained undetected for weeks at a time. A modified Severodvinsk entered service last year and is even quieter. A Business Insider article last year interviewed both the commander of the Second Fleet and the commander of U.S. naval submarine forces on the threat posed by today's Russian submarines. Commander Second Fleet, Vice Admiral Andrew Lewis, commented, "Our ships can no longer expect to operate in safe haven on the East Coast or merely cross the Atlantic unhindered," unquote. Vice Admiral Daryl Cottle, Commander U.S. Submarine Forces, expressed a similar concern when he stated, "It's pretty well known that now our homeland is not a sanctuary, so we have to be prepared here to conduct high-end combat operations in local waters," unquote. If the RCN is going to be able to participate in future conflict, it must be prepared for ASW action in the approaches to Halifax, the approaches to the Strait of Juan de Fuca, and the Canadian Arctic. No other platform is better suited to detect, track, classify, and engage a submarine than another submarine. If the RCN is to be a relevant future force, it must have submarines. A future submarine force is needed not just to facilitate access to the high seas for the RCN, not just to conduct traditional submarine missions, but rather a future Canadian submarine will be part of the very fabric of a continental defense network needed to protect Canadians and Canada's sovereign territory against missile strikes from the sea. As General Glenn Van Herk, commander of NORAD and U.S. Northcom, stated in his 8 March written testimony to the House Armed Services Committee, Russia has fielded the first 2 of their 9 planned Severodvinsk-class guided missile submarines, which are designed to deploy undetected within cruise missile range of our coastlines to threaten critical infrastructure during an escalating crisis. The challenge will be compounded in the next few years as the Russian Navy adds the Zircon hypersonic cruise missile to the Severodvinsk's arsenal. Competitors understand the importance of submarines. They understand how modern submarines paired with emerging missile technology can keep Canada, the United States, and indeed NATO out of a regional conflict. As Canada reinvests in her Navy for the threats of the future, she should do well to invest in the asymmetric capabilities that will keep competitors away from our shores. Submarines remain the best platform to execute the entirety of the ASW kill chain. A few years ago, I was privileged enough to attend a year-long international program at the United States Naval War College. Our professors consistently hammered home the value of leaning on the great masters. While the writings of Sunza, Clausewitz, Jomini, Mahan, Corbett, and others seem dated to many, they really just have a way of bringing clarity to the most challenging military problems. Oddly enough, the writings of a Prussian army general seem exceedingly appropriate to both the Canadian submarine acquisition and to the Canadian national psyche, especially in dangerous times such as today. In the opening paragraphs of the opening chapter of the opening book of On War, Clausewitz remarked, "Kind-hearted people might of course think that there was some ingenious way to disarm or defeat without too much bloodshed, and might imagine that this is the true goal of the art of war. Pleasant as it sounds, it is a fallacy that must be exposed. War is such a dangerous business that the mistakes which come from kindness are the very worst. The maximum use of force is in no way incompatible with the simultaneous use of intellect. If one side uses force without compunction, undeterred by the bloodshed it involves, while the other side refrains, the first will gain the upper hand, unquote. In the past few months, we have witnessed the world return to the brutality of war. We have seen our competitors stop at nothing to achieve their aims. We must provide Canada's soldiers, sailors, and aviators with the tools they need to prevail in the brutality of war. As the United States First President said during his first address to both houses of Congress, to be prepared for war is one of the most effectual means of preserving peace. Today's world is too dangerous not to be well prepared. If I could be so bold as to steal a page from the previous commander of the Royal Canadian Navy. A few months ago, Admiral Baines spoke about how our success in operations today are based on the hard work of those who went before us, those who spent their long hours procuring the Navy of today. Well, now it's our turn. We've enjoyed the fruits of their labor as they fought the procurement fight decades ago. Now we must work together across government and across industry to deliver the Canadian submarine force the tools they need to preserve the peace in the decades that lie ahead. So this is where I think submarines fit. In a Mahanian context, submarines remain the ultimate guarantor of trade, the protector of the great global commons. In today's security environment, where adversaries hold our power generation and distribution capabilities, transportation hubs, economic centers, force projection capabilities, and other critical infrastructure at risk each and every day, submarines are both our greatest deterrent and our last line of defense. They are the best, if not the only way, to defend against a devastating adversary submarine capability that, without submarines of our own, may not be unmasked until they launch their highly capable weapons into the heart of North America. Canada's next defense policy must rapidly adjust to a world that is armed with the most sophisticated weapons ever, yet at the same time, a world that has reverted to the aggressive behaviors and failed diplomacy of a different era. As Canada writes this new defense policy, it is essential they commit the funding and resources needed to rapidly rebuild our defenses and keep Canadians safe. These investments must include the tools necessary to not only understand above, on, and beneath our maritime approaches, but, and perhaps most importantly, they must include the ability to act decisively, and this only comes with a continued submarine capability. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions now.
Thanks very much, Jamie. That was an excellent geostrategic overview, if you will. You touched on a number of very critical areas, and you certainly gave me the insider perspective on what it's like to be and to have been a submarine CO. So let's move on with the questions. Barry, are you ready to take that role? Okay, I see one that's quite relevant. Again, from Bill Wood. I absolutely agree with the criticality of stealth, but would you agree that ultimately stealth is an enabler of range advantage for situational awareness, and so must go hand in hand with excellence in sensor performance? I hope you copy that, Jamie.
Yeah, absolutely. Stealth is an enabler for submarine operations. It's also a key component of safety because an unstealthy submarine won't survive very long on the battlefield. And of course, you know, modern sensors, world-leading sensors, are critical to making sense of the environment that the submarine's in. So yeah, they do go hand in hand. And I would take it a step further, that for a submarine to be contributing to continental defense, it also needs, modern and sophisticated communications to integrate into a network, so that when and where possible, it can share its information with higher headquarters, as they try and make sense of the maritime environment in the broader context of continental defense.
Okay, thanks
Okay,
for that,
good. I
Jamie.
see Barry's ready for posing the next question.
I am. Jamie, we've faced manning sub problems within the Navy, and particularly for submarines in the past decades. It got to the point where submarines was no longer a volunteer trade. So given the serious and ongoing recruiting challenges, what are your thoughts on having more automated submarines, or how do we address the crewing challenge?
I think it's more complex than just a single issue. If it were that easy to solve, it would have been solved a long time ago. Um, Sustained operations at sea, a sense of purpose, platform availability, I think are all critical enablers for submarines to go to sea. I can tell you, and I'm sure the submariners on the line will echo my comments. Um, I've taken a lot of skeptics on board submarines for a tour. I've never seen a skeptic go ashore. Once people understand the capability and know about it, whether they're in uniform or not, they like it. I get submarines aren't for anybody, aren't for everybody, pardon me. But certainly, and I have not been in a submarine job in 5 years, but when I was there, recruiting wasn't a problem. Throughput and training based on platform availability was the bigger challenge.
Okay, great. Thank you. A question from Professor Rob Hubert. He says, the Americans are currently building the new Columbia class and will soon begin development of the successor to the Virginia, the SSNX. What are the key issues and trends that we need to follow in the USN to ensure we remain relevant and incomparable? And I don't say equal, but at least interoperable with them.
I think interoperability with the submarine is first, it's an interesting concept because they're platforms that fundamentally operate independently. I think the ability to communicate, I think the ability um, to share similar systems so that we are procuring from a large line that is well resourced, parts availability isn't a challenge, is all very, very useful. I also made the comment interchangeable. Um, SSNs have the legs. SSNs are a weapon of maneuver, where I would argue an SSK is a weapon of position. So having a submarine that brings all of the capabilities necessary to operate in a modern maritime warfare environment, including the crew competencies, is the best thing we can bring to the table. So whether a Canadian submarine is involved in theater ASW off the coast of Halifax or off the coast of New York City, it's contributing to continental defense, and staying closer to home is likely an enabler to allow U.S. SSNs to deploy further afield and perhaps intercept any potential threats further away from the homeland. So I think it's more of a close to home, further deployed relationship between the SSK and the SSN, as long as our SSKs bring the technical competencies necessary to replace SSNs closer to the continent.
Okay, thank you. We'll open the floor up to further questions. With the first one we have here is, with respect to lethality, you mentioned cruise missiles, and would you suggest this should be a consideration for Canadian submarines as a deterrent and as a way to fully participate within NATO?
It was touched on earlier this morning, and I forget who mentioned it. I think it was Norm, but a Canadian submarine, I think the requirement and the justification is absolutely continental defense. And a cruise missile is not likely necessary for continental defense. However, when there is not a pressing need in time of crisis for continental defense, of course, the UN is going to deploy submarines globally, and extended deployments may be necessary to avoid or calm down a crisis. And in that context, I think a cruise missile capability is absolutely essential on a modern submarine. It brings both a deterrent effect, and an offensive joint fires capability for Canada when and where they choose.
Okay, thank you. I think that's it for questions right now. Tim, I think there's time then for some sort of general discussion of the overall theme of this morning, and I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Barry. I was thinking along those lines. And first of all, I want to thank everybody for cooperating, keeping their cameras off, keeping their microphones off as per instructions, etc. There were a few questions earlier on in the morning before we took our break. Perhaps we might be able to return to a couple of those. I'm just wondering if there were any that were not covered. I see one here. And in terms of general discussion, any one of the speakers might want to address this one. It might be something that Jamie could also provide a comment on. The nuclear component of an ice-capable submarine, which makes the vessel large enough for ice operations. How much of Canadians' aversion to atomic energy will prevent this type of vessel from ever being built, i.e. the view that nuclear power is nuclear weapons? Well, to me, that's a pretty tough one, but I'll throw it out there. Norm?
Yeah, I think and we certainly, I recall I was on the naval staff during SAP SSN, pardon me. So I wasn't on the project staff, we were the project directors, so we're the Navy. And I remember that question coming up, the differentiation between nuclear propulsion and nuclear weapons. And, and I agree, I don't know if it was Adam or Tim said it, but basically, yeah, you're going to get the guys out there that want to make that thing simply because they don't want it. Okay. So yes, you're dealing with the things that are always going to obfuscate for a reason. They know bloody well what we're talking about. So that's clear. It's not an argument with that. The issue came down to why we didn't, was multifolded. And I note in today's press that Congress has approved for Australians to go on board American nuclear submarines and take nuclear training. We never got anywhere like that. And the reason is the Americans were against us because they couldn't control it. Okay. And what do I mean by that? That means that the American submarine force, nuclear, the American nuclear capability at sea and U.S. Navy has had an unblemished record. How do you do that? You have iron discipline that was initially put in place by Hyman Rickover, but his successors afterwards in naval reactors to make sure, this is the rules. You do not know if it deviate from the rules. That's something they couldn't get their heads around at the time, saying, is Canada going to get this and do something different? We were unsure. And we didn't set forward a very good team when we went down there to explain it. So that's what caused it. So there's always that bit of everyone's throwing barbs at it for different reasons. But the issue there was, quite frankly, what came back down to the infrastructure costs compared to other government priorities. And at the time, in 1989, the Mulroney government was coming out of they had been recently reelected, but they were doing a budget and they couldn't afford daycare. And they said, oh, but we're going to have SSNs anyways. And that was a killer for it because it got in conflict with other government priorities. And we said this time before. So it's like today. Take a look at it. If you look at the recent estimates that came out of Canada a few months ago for the 2022-2023, what's it say? Defense is going to get somewhere in excess of $25 billion for that. That's a funding window. Indigenous Services Canada is $39.8 billion. That's where the government priorities are. So as long as the government says this is the priority, it's never going to happen. That's what the issues are within Canada and nuclear. And the reason I go on this one a bit is that you saw my slide earlier on the timeline. We get into a protracted debate on nuclear submarines, we can kiss it all goodbye. because by the time you wake up and say, it's okay, we're doing it, you've eaten more time, you've eaten years, and you're allowing the people that want to throw stones at it all to do that. And the answer is, we're going to get to a point where the Victoria class can't go on anymore. You've got to make sure we don't have any gaps. That's why it's important for everyone to understand that we've looked at this twice, both in 58 to 62, and again from 87 to 89. It was deemed unaffordable for government priorities. So we got to move on this one. That's what's really the driver. Can Canada afford nuclear submarines? Of course. Now we have technology to do it in Canada? Of course. It's government priorities. And that's, I think, what we need to understand about that one.
Thanks, Norm. That brings up one of the questions that was